We're honored to have the next speaker, Dr. Pervaiz Hassan. Dr. Pervaiz Hassan has a wide range of international awards and honors, including inclusion on the Global 500 Roll of Honor for the United Nations Environmental Programme in recognition outstanding practical achievements in the protection and improvement of the environment. The 7th International Conference on Environmental Law in Brazil 2003 was held against the backdrop, a tribute to Pervaiz Hassan. Sir has drafted the Pakistan Environmental Protection Ordinance 1983 and is a member of the Pakistan Environmental Protection Council. He's also been a member of Pakistan Marine Pollution Control Board. Under his leadership, International Covenant of Environment and Development was finalized and launched at the United Nations General Assembly in 1995. Sir has written numerous articles on environment law and national affairs in law journals and other publications in the US, Europe, and Pakistan, and has organized and chaired international law conferences and presented keynote addresses all over the world. Sir is on the editorial board of the Asia Pacific Journal of Environmental Law and a journal for human rights and environment. Sir, thank you so much for being part of this. We're honored to have you, sir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I really want to start with a confession. The reason I'm sitting here is because Nick is staying as a house guest. And there's a tradition in the East that when you honor a guest, you don't overlook the person he's staying with. So Nick, thank you for getting me on the high table. It's really a huge pleasure. I cannot tell you how moved I am to introduce, to commend, and to express my admiration for a lifetime friendship that I've had with Nick Robinson. Nick Robinson is international environmental law. I don't exaggerate. For those who are students of international environmental law, will have heard of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. Just yesterday, in 1972, that's when it all started for what we are all assembled here. And Nick Robinson was there in Stockholm in 1972. You get to the next milestone, the World Charter of Nature, 1982, General Assembly adopting that magnificent declaration by a vote of 106 votes, with the US as the only abstention. Nick Robinson drafted the World Charter of Nature. You get to the next milestone, that magnificent assembly of world leaders in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, popularly called the Earth Summit, that really carved the vision for much of what we today call sustainable development. It picked up from Stockholm in 1972, carried forward the legacy of the World Charter in 1982, and for the first time developed a human plan for the environment in that magnificent document called Agenda 21, in the few conventions that were adopted there, and in the adoption of that eloquent Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, 1992. Nick Robinson was there in Rio. You next move to Johannesburg, 2002. There's a decennial cycle for international diplomacy and symmetry on the environment. So we move now to Johannesburg, 1992, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. It really concretized and looked at what had happened at Rio and tried to move that forward. Nick Robinson was there in 1992, in 2002 in Johannesburg. We from Pakistan remember Johannesburg mostly because it was for the first time in human history that the judiciary had been mainstreamed into the agenda of environmental protection. Along with the summit in 2002, you had all the Chief Justices of the globe assembled in Johannesburg in 2002, and I think there were only two non-Chief Justices that had the privilege of addressing them. Of course, I was one of them. Nick Robinson was there in 2002. I mentioned my being there, but I did something that I'm very proud of. I acknowledged before the global judiciary, the Chief Justices. Incidentally, Pakistan was represented by Sheikh Riaz Ahmed at that time. He was there in that audience. I acknowledged before all the Chief Justices of the globe the monumental contribution that our iconic Justice Salim Akhtar had made to the contribution of environment development in Pakistan through Shell Asya. We paid him a tribute there in 2002. Nick's involvement in the development, in the conceptualization, in the consolidation of environmental law progresses. I could speak for literally centuries for what he's done. He is the pace setter. To speak about a few anecdotes that I've had in my professional life. We've known each other for about 30 years. Of my professional association in environmental law with this giant of a man, Nick Robinson. I first got to know him and meet him in Perth, Australia in 1990, good about 30 years earlier. There's an international organization, the most coveted, the most respected conservation organization in the world, the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. It works globally through 6 commissions. There's species survival, there's national parks, and one of the more important commissions of this particular organization is the Commission on Environmental Law. I had been asked to be the deputy chair of this Commission on Environmental Law when another person from this subcontinent, Nagendra Singh, the president of the International Court of Justice, who was the deputy chair of this commission, and he was at that time the judge of the the president of the International Court of Justice, he had died, and I was asked to come in as the deputy. And 2 years later in Perth, the General Assembly there elected me as the chair. Now, when you get elected as chair of a commission in IUCN, it's serious work. It's a serious mandate. It's a serious responsibility. It's a serious opportunity. And you've got to really plan your 3-6 years that you will be there to lead the events globally in that particular field. And the most important thing before an elected chair is to pick up his team. And the chair has to pick up 6 vice chairs from all over the globe. But the most important person in his commitment is the person that he picks up as his deputy chair. And I turned to my predecessor and I requested a list of the best persons that I could really turn to for that kind of leadership. Nick Robinson's name was in that list. I called up Nick, we were all staying in a hotel. I called up Nick, I introduced myself, and I said, Nick, I need to see you. And we got together at that hotel in Perth, in Australia, in 1990. And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Nick, I'm proud of that day, and I'm happy that you said yes when I requested you to be the Deputy Chair of the Commission on Environmental Law. And what started really was for me an exciting adventure. I graduated from law practice in Pakistan. I'd done some work in the region, Asia Pacific. I'd done some work for SCAP. But this was truly a global opportunity. And Nick and I set to work. And I'll tell you the kind of support and the kind of anchor he was to the success of what we eventually accomplished. First, and I talked about this morning at the Judicial Academy, and thank you for the lovely morning we had there. The biggest issue really for me as one who came from a developing world was to jumpstart, fast track the capacity of this region to respond to the enormous challenges that were emerging in the global environmental scene. The West had its lawyers, the West had its judges, the West had its laws, but you didn't have that in Africa, you didn't have that in the Asia Pacific region, you didn't have that in South Asia. So Nick and I started thinking, how can we start this whole thing? And we thought of a Training the Trainer project, and we ended up with the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law in Singapore. Nick and I raised money with the Asian Development Bank, with the National University of Singapore, and we put together an opportunity in Singapore where we brought in a world-class faculty to teach international environmental law to young students, young lawyers, young teachers from the Asia and Pacific region. We gave them materials, we gave them courses, and we tried to convert them into ambassadors for environmental causes and to teaching when they returned to their countries. There were few people that went from this country. You might know these names. One of them is sitting there, Mr. Justice Pervaiz Hassan. He went to Singapore for the Asia Pacific Center in Environmental Law, reinforcing a relationship of being a student of Nick Robinson, which he had been at PACE some years earlier. So that's where the cementing took place in the Asia Pacific Center at the National University of Singapore in Singapore. And there's another name that you might know, Mr. Justice Mansoor Ali Shah. He also is a student of Nick Robinson. And if you see his dynamism, if you see his orientation to convert everything into an environmental pilgrimage, the making of Syed Mansoor Ali Shah took place at the National University of Singapore, at the Asia Pacific Center of Environmental Law, with Nick Robinson as the head of the faculty in Singapore. So we're both very proud that in less than a decade, it could have taken a century, in less than a decade, this region bloomed with environmental lawyers. This region bloomed with environmental law courses, with law schools teaching environmental law, which none of them knew anything about, and none of them had intended to do anything about for a long time. So Nick catalyzed that enormous project which benefited this whole region, and I wanted to acknowledge particularly for what he was able to do through Justice Mansoor Ali Shah, through Justice Pervaiz Hassan, and the others that he shaped in the making of environmental leaders in Pakistan. So thank you, Nick, for that opportunity. I'll also talk about, Nick and my efforts to put together a global treaty on environment. All of you students of human rights would know that the internationalization of the protection of human rights took place through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. An attempt that was converted into treaty law 18 years later. The declaration came in 1948. In 1966, 18 years later, the global community came with the international covenants on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. So when Nick and I were leading the commission out of Switzerland, IUCN is based in Switzerland. We had an office in Germany that I'd commute to at least once a month to help out with, the support that we were giving to the global community on environmental matters. We, at that time, felt that we could, like the jump starting of legal education, that we jumpstart the transition from the World Charter of Nature, from the Stockholm Principles on Environmental Law, from the Rio Declaration of Human Environment and Development into a global treaty. So for the 6 years that I headed that commission, we put together the most exciting group of judges, of lawyers, of policymakers from East and the West and the North and the South, and we put them on a table with Nick and I shepherding that table, and eventually we succeeded in bringing about some degree of consensus between the South and the North and the East and the West, and we put that together in a document that I'm very proud of today, and I shared it with all of you when I last came and spoke here. It's the draft of the International Covenant on Treaty on Environment and Development. We presented that to the General Assembly in 1995. Now, that was our vision, to give the global community a treaty on environment and development. We thought we had succeeded, but so many years later, that treaty has not taken place. Last development that took place on that was about, I think, 2 years ago. France took the initiative, I think Macron, the president, I think Nick was invited, I was invited to Paris, and we have tried to resurrect that initiative through the French sponsorship of the Global Pact on the Environment. So it's coming. Delegates met in Kenya a few weeks ago. Nick got through to me, and that's how things work. Can you help with Pakistan? So I picked up the phone, I talked to Malik Aslam Amin, our advisor on climate change, and the representative who was going to Kenya to represent Pakistan on the Global Pact had long discussions with me. I gave him a background, and I think he flew the Pakistani flag in favor of the Global Pact. So things that Nick has led, things that he has conceptualized, things he has put on the table for us to carry forward, and things that are making a difference in the global community today. I acknowledge that Nick has led many such initiatives. I was very fortunate to be a part of the effort. He then succeeded me as the chair of the Commission of Environmental Law, and when he succeeded me as the chair, he co-opted me now to help him out as a member of his steering committee. And for another 8 years, he and I helped out with global issues. You know, that's the quality of my association with the man that I'm very proud to introduce to you and to, hold out as a friend. He's come here because of his wisdom, because of his leadership, because of his reputation, because of his cutting-edge thinking. LUMS has turned to him to be on the International Advisory Board of the university, which starts its deliberations, inaugural session, day after tomorrow. And I requested Nick to come here 2 days earlier so I could express my lifetime gratitude for the warmth of his friendship and the quality of his intellect. He walked into my office, I think 48 hours ago at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I opened the door and I said, Nick, you responded to my bucket list. If you know what a bucket list is, I'm a young 77, so I treasure these moments. It's a great moment for me to have Nick as my house guest, a person with whom I've been in the trenches with him. We have traveled all over the world, whether it's Kazakhstan, whether it's Australia, China, wherever. We were there, and as he was telling some of the judges today, that we've spent more time in hotels all over the world than together. And it's with that particular background of his having improved the quality of my life, the quality of my, approach to things that I've tried to bring that message into my life in Pakistan. So I wanted to say a huge thank you to you, Nick. You've been a marvelous friend, a mentor, a guide, and I want to say that it's a great day for me to welcome you in the midst of my fraternity. I thank you.